Hey there, Internet. Barokoshama here, and it has been a hot minute since you've seen me on the webs. We're going to be doing a pretty good deep dive into the Elemental Shaman Mythic Plus scene for Season 2, essentially, starting for 10.15. I know the patch is dropping. A lot of people are kind of requesting information on what's going on with Elemental Shaman, and it's been a hot minute since I've talked about it. A lot's going on this summer. I hope everyone else's summer was really, really good. But to go over what we're going to be covering in this guide, it's going to be talents, your builds, stats for the build, trinkets, gear, and embellishments, add-ons, Weakauras that are useful for the Elemental Shaman, and of course your rotation and spell priority for different target counts, along with cooldown usage within Mythic Plus and tips and tricks for that kind of situation. But before we get started, I do want to say, if you guys want to see more of my content, definitely hit that subscribe button, like the video if you like it, comment down below what your thoughts are. It really helps with the whole algorithm thing. And check out my social medias, my Patreon page if you want to support my content. It helps me make more videos like this with my editor, David. And check out my Twitch live stream where I stream Elemental Shaman content, and I'm actually gearing up an Evoker as well. I don't think I'll do any content on it, but it'll be interesting to play that augmentation spec that's coming. All the links to everything will be in the description down below, but let's get started. All right, for your talents, there are two types of builds I would want to consider when it comes to competitive Mythic Plus and the Mythic Plus scene. Both have the lightning style nuances with electrified shocks and ice fury play. So let's run through them and some key talent notes. So this season, you'll actually want to play either IcyHot or lightning build, the actual lightning build. Wildfire just isn't cutting it on single target this season. I understand a lot of people don't like Ice Fury, but with the whole priority target damage becoming more of a niche that we want to fill and can fill, Wildfire is just less of a preferred build in competitive play. It can still pull some big numbers, and believe me, it's super fun to play. However, the lightning build is just far more superior when it comes to prolonged AoE encounters and single target fights, as well as burst potential, while giving your class and your group more utility in the form of cooldown reduction to your nature spells with Flash of Lightning. So, Flash of Lightning, what is this talent? It's becoming more and more noticed because of its extremely strong utility cooldown reduction. Not only does it affect our offensive nature spells like Stormkeeper and Storm Elemental, but it also affects things like Wind Shear, which is our interrupt, Earth Elemental, Spiritwalker's Grace, Capacitor Totem, Poison Cleansing Totem, and Ancestral Guidance, Astral Shift, Cleanse Spirit, Call of the Elements, Greater Purge, Tremor Totem, Nature Swiftness, Stone Skin Totem, Lightning Lasso, and Thunderstorm, as well as Gust of Wind. So pretty much all of our utility spells are affected by Flash of Lightning. This is extremely strong cooldown reduction, especially for our Wind Shear. We can get our Wind Shear down to like a 5 or 6 second cooldown if we have high haste and we're just spamming lightning bolts or chain lightnings. Like, it's ridiculous. You should really be considering the implications of this talent alone in your keys and how useful that is. Liquid Magma Totem. I've heard some kind of questions regarding this talent, as it is more of a wildfire build or like a wildfire type of builds, since it helps to spread flame shocks in your initial burst windows in those kind of builds. But ever since like they buffed the ability itself in Dragonflight, and with the addition to Call of the Elements, or Call of the Elements being able to reset its cooldown, it has been a staple talent in Mythic Plus. With how little attention, or I guess how little is needed or is required to use the ability, aside from just placing it down too early in a pull and it just dying immediately because the tank hasn't gotten enough aggro yet, it does a noticeably substantial amount of damage in your overall for how easy it is to use. So think of it more as like an extension to your burst windows, either before or after you've used your Stormkeeper charges. Also, it is quite useful to have those two instant cast spells back to back while you need to get into position for a large pull, or you're on the move on boss fights, like casting a Liquid Magma Totem, Call the Elements, and then another Liquid Magma Totem. It's really good, useful GCDs to be able to use on the move. So moving on to Ice Fury and Electrified Shocks. I'm going to put these hand in hand here. Now I know a lot of people cannot get on board with this talent, and I can completely understand, as it adds yet another seemingly complicated step or component to buff, juggle, while everything else is going on, and there's a lot going on with Elemental Shaman. So there's good news though. You don't really need to worry about it outside of like up to 3 or 4 targets. However, it adds a significant amount of damage to some of your biggest single target hitting spells. So it's definitely worth getting used to. This talent is also used in your hybrid IcyHot build, so hence the name Icy and then Hot. So it has wildfire elements and then the Ice Fury and Electrified Shocks. So you will want to learn this and how to use it to be able to do the most damage. I will simplify it though, just so though more people can get on board with it. In single target, you just want to have at least like 4 or 5 seconds remaining on the Electrified Shocks debuff before you cast Elemental Blast, and then following that Elemental Blast up with a Lightning Bolt. Now, with lower haste amounts, you may need 5 seconds remaining on the Electrified Shocks debuff, but you'll want to check your own character's casting speed for this to kind of check the nuances of it. And you just want to make sure that the debuff is at least active on the target for those 2 spells casting back to back. This is a tip just to start with Electrified Shocks and getting used to using Ice Fury and Frost Shock in your rotation. It will just become a lot more easier to maintain the debuff for all of your other nature damaging spells as time goes on. It is also an extremely powerful spell to cast while on the move. If you consider Ice Fury empowering their Frost Shocks, they're just quite strong, especially when they hit up to 4 targets. So if you need to build up Maelstrom while you're moving, or you know there's a big movement coming on a boss fight, right? You can use these Electrified Shocks, empowered Frost Shocks with Ice Fury to prep for that movement, especially in AoE. So keep that in mind. We'll go over a lot more of the use of Electrified Shocks debuff in our rotation section, but I wanted to talk about it here first. Surge of Power. This passive talent is much easier to play in the Lightning build, as you don't need to worry about spreading and maintaining flame shocks like you would in the Wildfire build or IcyHot build. It is simple. In single target or 2 target scenarios, you consume the buff with Lightning Bolt, especially with Stormkeeper charges. That's extremely important. That's a huge boost in your damage. In AoE, consume it with Chain Lightning. That's pretty much it. It doesn't do anything in AoE until you reach 6 targets, but nonetheless, you don't really need to pay attention to it until you reach that mob count anyway. Then you will be weaving, obviously, in Chain Lightnings between your Earthquakes and Elemental Blasts to make the most out of Surge of Power if you're at that target count or more. So if you are playing the IcyHot build, obviously you need to pay attention to using the Surge of Power buff to spread and maintain Flame Shocks if you're in an AoE encounter, and if you don't have like the maximum amount of Flame Shocks out at a time, being 6 obviously. So I guess TLDR is in Lightning build, Surge of Power is just a lot easier to play with. Okay, Lightning Rod. This is one of the key components to the Lightning build. This talent can either be extremely powerful addition to your damage or lackluster passive. That's up to you and how you use it. It all comes down to how well you use it and applying the debuff to as many targets as possible within your Stormkeeper burst windows, especially in AoE. So it is important that you're switching targets between your cast of Elemental Blast in those AoE scenarios, and make sure that it is being cast on a target that does not have a current Lightning Rod debuff active on it, or it's about to run out. In single target, this is just kind of like a passive that it's a part of your damage in your background. You don't really need to worry about it as long as you're doing your rotation properly. But you just need to make sure in single target that you have this debuff applied on the target before you use any Stormkeeper charges with Lightning Bolts. I have a Lightning Rod tracker that I actually use. So if you want to visualize your Lightning Rod's debuffs on your targets, visualize it more of like a dot essentially. Then I will leave the link to that Weakauras in the description down below. Master of the Elements. Only really worry about this in single target and low target count kind of scenarios. If you have a Lava Burst available, that's pretty much it. Will what you'll want to definitely use the buff to increase the damage of your elemental blast in single target or 2 target scenarios, and like use it maybe on Chain Lightning, especially with Stormkeeper on like 3 to 4 target scenarios. Since the Lightning build, we don't use Echo of the Elements like you would in Wildfire or a variation of the Wildfire build. We're limited to just 1 stack of Lava Bursts, but we are required to take Master of the Elements in order to get Liquid Magma Totem. So we kind of have to use it. We'll make the most of it. Okay, Echoes of Great Sundering. This talent is actually great for multi-target and cleave scenarios, though because you are dedicating quite a lot of resources, aka Maelstrom, to using an Earthquake with this talent, make sure that the targets are actually going to be within the Earthquake for its full duration, if not most of its duration. Otherwise, you just wasted a bunch of Maelstrom. So it is extremely important that if your tank is kiting, right, put down an Earthbind totem or stun them with a capacitor totem if you're going to put an Earthquake down, and lead your Earthquakes in the direction that the tank is going to be kiting. That way the mobs are going to be going through the Earthquake while they're being moved, and you get the full duration or most of the damage from the Earthquake. Otherwise, it's just not worth putting down at all, and you're better off either pooling Maelstrom or kind of putting an Elemental Blast into a priority target or swapping between targets. So just be smart about your placement for your Earthquakes and you'll be just fine. All right, let's move over to the Shaman tree key talents. Obviously, there are some no-brainer talents in here, but I'm going to talk about a few of them in a little bit more detail. So Plains Traveler, pretty much always use this talent. No reason not to, as we're already limited with the amount of defensives that Elemental Shaman have. Brimming with Life, no-brainer talent as well. Take it. Extra stamina, lower CD on Reincarnate. Gust of Wind, extra or extreme mobility. You decide. Really useful. Also, you can do some pretty cheeky skips to be able to finish casts while dodging mechanics, right? Like, it's good use. Nature Swiftness. This talent is actually kind of a damage increase, especially when you allow yourself to use it with Elemental Blast. You can instant cast Elemental Blast. This helps you while you're moving, obviously, or to spread lightning rods really quickly and a Stormkeeper burst window. Obviously, you can instant cast Chain Lightnings or Lightning Bolts with it as well, but the best use of it is probably going to be Elemental Blast for the most part. Spirit Walker's Grace, kind of a no-brainer as well. Great mobility, right? You're able to cast while you're moving and while you're getting knocked back from some mechanics in dungeons. Earth Elemental can also be used to take pressure off of the tank or the healer, as well as an extra defensive, as when it's out, you take 5% less damage from your talent, as well as it gives you 15% maximum HP. Just make sure that when you summon the Earth Elemental, that any mobs that have a frontal abilities are not going to kill your party members. Done that a few times. All right, Spirit Wolf. This should be used pretty much most of the time. It helps us survive some incoming large damage abilities from bosses if you don't have a defensive available. But the only downside to using it, obviously, is that you have to sit in Ghost Wolf to stack up the damage reduction. So, wish they would change that. Thunderous Paws. There's 2 scenarios where you should actually use Thunderous Paws over Spirit Wolf. One is Entangling Weak affixes. It just gets rid of the entangling for you. Very easy. Use GCD instead of trying to move out of this. And if you're in Uldamon, you can actually use it to get rid of the slow debuff from the last boss, Deos or something like that is his name. So Thunderous Paws actually removes that slow, but it's also a dot. Just be careful to move out of the big swirly after you've gotten rid of it. Purge. This spell is used a lot less this season, I'm finding, and with Priest being in the majority of the top dungeons, right, Purge is already kind of in the group. So, however, you will want to consider using this in Underrot and Halls of Infusion if you don't play with a Priest, but kind of need that dispel on those shields. Cleanse Spirit. So this is a mandatory talent to take in Afflicted Weeks or dungeons that have curse effects in them, such as Underrot, though you shouldn't be letting that cast go through anyway, so maybe make an argument with your group that you didn't run decurse in that dungeon. But also Uldamon, you'll want to look at those wardens in Uldaman, getting those curse casts off as well. This is a helpful decurse for that dungeon. Poison Cleansing Totem. Again, mandatory talent to take in afflicted weeks. It takes care of the affix for you. Your group's going to love having a shaman in there, and it's also quite useful in areas like Neltharion's Lair for Neuraxis and Halls of Infusion for the frogs that apply the stacking poison when they melee players. So keep those things in mind. Stone Skin Totem. This is a great option and is not played enough, I think, because it brings added damage reduction to physical damaging abilities in a lot of bosses. I think people kind of skip on this, but it should definitely be played a lot more, especially in higher keys. So for example, Kragmaw in Underrot uses Tantrum, which does AoE physical damage to your group. Rockmora in Neltharion's Lair also does Shatter, which is a huge damaging ability to your group, along with Ularog, which summons like those bellowing idols that scream and cause debris to fall on your party members. In Brackenhide Hollow, you have Ryra Hacklaw, the Hacklaw War Band. She uses Savage Charge on the tank. You can reduce that damage by 10% with the totem, as well as Gash Tooth uses Marked for Butchery and Gash Frenzy, which puts a dot on all your players. Chargath in Neltharis uses Grounding Spear, so the initial hit of Grounding Spear does physical damage, and Dragon Strike, which is a bleed dot that they put on a random player. Along with, in Neltharis, there's actually Forge Master Gorak, so if you're already running the totem in there, you can use the totem for the initial hit from when he starts to cast Might of the Forge, where he goes to the Forge and he starts hitting it. That initial, when he jumps to the forge, that does physical damage to your group. So the totem can help reduce that incoming damage. Gulping Goliath in Halls of Infusion. So this boss does Overpowering Croak, which is a very hard hitting AoE to your entire group. It hits, I think, 3 times in succession, and the totem can help reduce that damage, help your healers out. In Freehold, there's 3 instances where you can use this. So Captain Eudora does Powder Shot, which targets random players, and you can reduce, I think, 3 or 4 shots if you time it correctly, the damage of those. Trothak, the Shark Puncher, he does Ripper Punch to a nearby melee, so it's either going to be on the tank or one of your melee players. You could just watch the cooldown of that Ripper Punch and then put a totem down before he casts it. And then, of course, Harlan Sweetie, he does Whirling Dagger, which puts a physical bleed on all of the players, and this ramps up over the course of the fight. So that's really good in Freehold. And finally, Sentinel Talandras, one of the banes of Mythic Plus this season. So he casts a hard-hitting bleed as well as initial hit from Earthen Shards. So the initial hit does a lot of damage, and then the bleed afterward does a lot of damage. And honestly, if you don't have paladins or dwarfs in that dungeon, it hurts a lot. If you can't find I've died so many times to it that I race changed over to dwarf this season. So Stone Skin Totem helps to reduce the damage of that ability as well. Moving on to Nature's Guardian, one of our very few kind of cheat death mechanics that we have. So this talent is nice. It adds bonus to our survivability as a shaman, which we have very little of, but it can be opted out for other more important utility spells if you don't need it and your healer's not even tracking it anyway. So keep that in mind. Finally, Ancestral Guidance. Talent's getting hard nerfed along with a lot of other talents like it, like Vampiric Embrace and that Druid ability, which I always forget the name of, but it's getting nerfed. So it's not going to do pretty much any healing in AoE, but it's still going to do a lot of healing in single target. So it may be worth taking in some situations where on tyrannical weeks or high fortified keys, where if you line it up with your single target burst windows with Stormkeeper, it could add a lot of healing. So keep that in mind, but it's not as powerful in 10.1.5. All right, I quickly want to talk about IcyHot because the majority of this guide, it's not about it, right? If you guys absolutely hate the lightning build style and you're totally not okay with playing Lightning Rod or Mountains Will Fall, right? The IcyHot build is still quite strong, especially in low mob target count dungeons like Neltharian's Lair and Vortex Pinnacle. It brings both strong attributes of single target from the Lightning build, but also strong 2 to 4 target cleave from the Wildfire build. It's a happy medium between those two. I had used this build most of season 1 towards the end just to get title and compete with other meta classes. So if you're interested in an in-depth guide for this build specifically, please check out my IcyHot guide. It is still relevant. I will put it in the description of the video down below. Let's move on to stat weights. So it's pretty simple stat weights now with the new tier set. Our stats now just look more like this in season 2. Crit being greater than or equal to haste, and then mastery, versatility. So though it's important to understand why the stat weights have shifted in priority with the new tier set, previously, we have weighed versatility to be much higher when running high level keys just because of Shaman not having a lot of survivability, right? We were not a tanky class. We could die very easily, so stacking versatility was kind of needed. Though it seemed that for now, versatility is needed less in this season's keys. Why is that? This could be because the dungeons themselves have less one-shotting mechanics or spiky damage profiles from the mobs and bosses. It can also be due to the healing profiles that we have to work with this season. It also helps that we have more gear to choose from that will give us added survivability components, such as the Spore Cloak crafted item. Now let's talk about Mastery. Why is Mastery higher on the preferred stats? So Mastery has become more of a preferred stat for Mythic Plus just due to how our new tier set interacts with Maelstrom generation. So after consuming Stormkeeper, your Maelstrom generation is increased by 50% from your generating spells. So this buff, along with Mastery procking on your abilities, brings your Maelstrom generation up significantly after Stormkeeper. So this is also why the tier has the tier set's been nerfed so many times since it kind of hit the PTR in the following weeks when the patch dropped. So it's been nerfed several times because essentially our Maelstrom was able to be capped very easily. And this provided us with higher damage and burst windows in turn. So more Maelstrom, obviously now, more Maelstrom generation also means more potential Lightning Rod debuffs to be active at once during AoE. These factors all contribute to why Mastery has stayed strong and relevant even in AoE encounters, whereas last season Mastery was really only relevant in single target. Crit has also gained and is maintaining a high profile in priority, more value for its tier set due to its increased amount of crit damage that you get from your AoE spells for the tier set, such as Chain Lightning, Lava Beam, and Earthquakes, for the duration of the buff discussed previously in the Mastery Stats section. So when you have that window of generating more Maelstrom, your crits from your AoE spells are also critting harder. I think it's 20% more. So that's why crit is getting a little bit higher here in the season. Moving on to Trinkets, Gear, and Embellishments. So Trinkets can be quite powerful this season. There are a lot of new and fun on-use trinkets that have been put in the back of the game or put back into the game this season. Notable ones that you'll want to work with as priority are as follows. Try and get an Ominous Chromatic Essence. I have yet to get one, but this trinket serves its purpose as kind of like a stat stick with a bit of extra flavor. So it is quite popular amongst most DPS classes, so the probability of you having multiple of them in a group allows you to benefit from the additional buffs it gives per dragonflight. Communicate with your team, obviously, to see if they want to run multiple buffs or if it's just better for you specifically and not as big of a deal for your group to get most of the buffs out of it. But other than that, try and get this trinket. Also, Vessel of Searing Shadows. This is a really great secondary trinket that I would recommend getting. This trinket gives you both a boost to your haste, which is strong stat for Elemental Shaman, and an added damage component, which is good for single target. This brings a bit more priority target damage to your character, but other downsides, obviously, is that you take a bit of damage. So it's kind of like that kiss-curse relation with this trinket. Another really good one, it's an on-use trinket, Spoils of Neltharius. So this is great for an on-use trinket. It boosts your stats during burst windows and dungeons. You'll probably want to track it, so using a Weakora to track which stat it's going to give you can be useful. So the good news is that this is not a very important to track for Elemental Shaman, because all of our stats, or all of the stats, is like pretty useful for it, especially mastery, even in AoE, single target, right? They're good in any scenario, right? Even the versatility is going to be good for you eventually. So really should be more considered for single target when you're wanting to stack up either haste for single target or mastery after you've used your Stormkeeper to get that additional Maelstrom generation. So I'll leave a link to a Weakora to track it in the description down below. Idol of Pure Decay. This trinket's okay. It's just kind of like good for 1 to 3 targets. If you can't get your hands on any of the other ones from Raid, this is a good alternative for Tyrannical weeks. Nothing really much more to say about it. Erupting Spear Fragment, also another pretty decent, good on-use trinket alternative to Spoils of Neltharis for AoE situations. I found myself actually running both Spoils and this trinket since I have yet to get a Chromatic Essence or Vessel. But yes, Erupting Spear Fragment, 1.5 minute cooldown as opposed to the 2 minute from Spoils, so it's not hard to play both of those trinkets in Mythic Plus. And then Rot Crusted Voodoo Doll. I would mainly use this in Raid. Actually, I do use this trinket in Raid, but it can be a good single target trinket to bring into Mythic Plus, especially on Tyrannical weeks, so consider it. All right, Embellishments. Ooh. This is not really a controversial section, but it's more of like okay, when you start doing this, you want to use this set or this embellishment. So Horizon Striders set bonus. We're talking about the gloves and the belt here, people. This is your best embellishment for all around play. Obtain this by crafting the Wind Spirit or the Wind Spirit's lasso and the Scale Rain grips. So the belt and the gloves. This also means that your glove slot will be taken up and can't be used as a tier slot. If you're transitioning a lot between Raid and Mythic Plus, and you're kind of looking on what embellishments you want to bring because you do a lot of that content separately, this is a really good all bases covered embellishment. Yes, it takes up both embellishment slots, but it's a good start. Next, I want to talk about Shadow Flame Tempered Armor Patch. This is a really great alternative to use instead of Horizon set, as it transfers well into Raid content as well as single target, which is, I want to say, one of the places where you kind of want more added damage for Elemental Shaman is your single target damage. You do great on AoE, just get a little bit more single target, you'll be good. Shadow Flame Tempered Armor Patch gives you that. Elemental Lariat. This embellishment is really strong later in the tier, so if you don't have a whole lot of sockets on your gear, I wouldn't recommend using it until then. I would consider using it myself later this tier, because I'm going to be pairing it with the next one, which is Undulating Spore Cloak. So this item can be extremely useful in high-end Mythic Plus and Raid content, especially on Sarkareth. So as it saves players from death a lot of times. It's a huge absorption shield. It's great. I'm now reaching the point in my own keys that I require to use this one. So this is going to be my next craft, and I also need it because my guild is progressing on Sarkareth, so it's good. It's a good window for me to be able to use this. So I'd recommend crafting this one if you're pushing like 20s, sorry, not 20s, 24s or higher. That's kind of like the point where damage is just so high for the raid or for the group that you're gonna need a little bit of extra oomph to keep yourself alive. And anything below that, you can kind of get away with not using it. You can't do tons of damage if you're on the floor taking a nap, so consider using it. Lastly, Alchemical Flavor Pocket. Doesn't really take up an embellishment slot. Yes, it can be pricey depending on your server, but it will save your food buff if you do end up dying in a dungeon, which is a DPS increase. So think about that. All right, add-ons and Weakauras. What's going to kind of help me as a new Shaman player or an Elemental Shaman player get into the class and be a little bit better at it? One, obviously being a Maelstrom tracker. You want to track your resources. It's your bread and butter of your damage, obviously, so why not make it easier for you? So I'd recommend using some sort of Maelstrom tracker to make sure that you're not overcapping on your Maelstrom or wasting your resources, and you're not spending extra globals on things that you don't need to. So being able to track this helps you play better by preparing your next few casts in advance, understanding what you're going to be casting the next few spells. So I myself have switched over to Afner's Shaman package. This comes with a Maelstrom tracker in it, and it also has a lot more of like your debuffs, your tracking, your cooldowns, right? It's great. So I'll leave a link to that in the description of the video down below. It's great all around. After makes great packages for most classes, I'm pretty sure. So take a look at that. Next one is the Plater nameplates. A great fully customizable UI enhancing add-on. Just allows you to create your own nameplates or customize them for players as well as enemy mobs. So great for organizing the information that's displayed on your screen in a more coherent manner. So this is a lot of what is happening in WoW. It's hard to kind of see things clearly. It can get very overwhelming, especially in high keys. So a cleaner UI that delivers information just helps alleviate that noise. I recommend Plater for that. Details. Yes, we all want to see the big numbers on our screen and make sure that we're beating our friends in overall in the dungeon. But more than that, details helps keep track of things like crowd control, damage taken, right? Interrupts, disease, dispel, or dispels in general, etc. Like there's so much more information in there that helps you guys, as well as death logs, like what happened to that you died. Like details gives you more information. So being able to see those stats helps you know where you can also improve as a player outside of your damage. So consider looking more closely at your team's and yourself's overall performance in the dungeon instead of just damage using details. Wow, this sounds like an ad. We're not sponsored. Next, I would talk about Aberrus Tier Tracker Weakauras. This one's really simple. It's just tracking the internal cooldown of Stormkeeper that you get from your tier set. So I would consider tracking that internal cooldown because it allows you to prepare for it coming up so that you don't waste the charge on something that gives you less damage, like just whiffing it out there when you could have used in single target an elemental blast, got surge of power, right? You had electrified shocks running at the same time. You used that surge of power buff on the lightning bolt from Stormkeeper, and you did a whole shit ton of damage from that lightning bolt because it overloaded a bunch of times. Yada yada. Also, you can make sure that you have several lightning rod debuffs out during a big AoE pull so that you're getting the most out of that chain lightning that you would from Stormkeeper, or you're not overcapping. I talk with my hands a lot. So consider tracking the Weakauras so you're not wasting potential Maelstrom as well. If you're just spam casting Chain Lightning, right? And then the tier set procs, but you're already at like 60 Maelstrom and you're fighting like 6 targets or more, right? You're going to overcap your Maelstrom. It's not good. Because that Chain Lightning is going to overload on every target hit. So track the tier set. Use an internal cooldown tracker for it. It's going to help you in your gameplay a lot, trust me. I'll leave a link to that one as well in the description down below. One that's not as important, but I find still using myself, is a lightning rod tracker group, kind of similar to a flame shock tracker group, right? It allows me to see how many lightning rods I have out at once and gives me the remaining cooldown on those things. So I'll display it here on screen for you guys. But you can make the decision to squeeze out a bit more damage if you're visualizing those lightning rod buffs, especially helpful when you combine it with a tier set tracker. You can kind of see why those things would work well together. Add-on that I kind of want to talk about, or I guess it's an add-on that's kind of made of Weakauras. It's Omni CD. This add-on allows you to track your party members' cooldowns. Super useful when in organized groups to see, or even in pug groups in some scenarios, to see when your group has offensive or defensive spells available, along with their interrupts. And it's important to understand that overlapping cooldowns or interrupts is extremely punishing this season. So being able to track everything clearly helps alleviate that possibility, right? We're talking about, let's say I have Astral Shift available, but like the paladin healer in my group or tank also has Blessing of Sacrifice, right? If I use Astral Shift at the same time as them using Blessing of Sacrifice on me, well, we just overlapped 2 defensive cooldowns, and now we're not going to have it for when we next need it, right? Being able to track things more clearly alleviates that possible danger and being able to plan things. So definitely check out Omni CD. I recommend using it. And finally, like bigwigs or DBM, right? Being able to help you track boss timers or abilities and notifications for mechanics in the dungeons. You'll want to pay attention to those things too, right? So it tracks a whole lot of stuff that is useful. I'd also recommend trying out playing with it. I switched over to bigwigs myself from DBM, and I prefer that more now. It just kind of helps me get more notifications clearer, and when mobs are kind of targeting me with abilities that are going to kill me, so I can pop in an astral shift in time or something, right? So bigwigs or DBM, one of those two. All right, let's get into your rotation in spell priority. I'm going to try and simplify this for each target count as much as I possibly can. I know there's a lot of fluffs and ifs and buts, or like depending on your target count and whatever buffs you have available, you do a certain thing. I'll try and simplify things for you guys to make things easier. Your main priority in single target for the lightning build is just to build enough Maelstrom to Elemental Blast. But try and buff that Elemental Blast with your Lava Burst and Master of the Elements before you cast it. Also, before you cast that Lava Burst, you have 4 or 5 seconds left remaining on Electrified Shocks. If not, cast Frost Shock before the Lava Burst, and then Elemental Blast into a Lightning Bolt, and rinse and repeat this. Build your Maelstrom with Lightning Bolt, obviously. Keep up that Electrified Shocks debuff, and pool your Maelstrom, pool enough Maelstrom when you're approaching a Stormkeeper window, like your own Stormkeeper, not the tier set, obviously. But pool enough Maelstrom to be able to cast 2 Elemental Blasts back to back to get the Surge of Power buff for each Lightning Bolt of Stormkeeper. That's pretty much it. But for cleave scenarios, for 2 target cleave scenarios, it's almost the exact same rotation as single target, except you'll want to be swapping back and forth between Elemental Blast and Earthquake for spending your Maelstrom. As long as you have the targets that are going to be within your Earthquake for its full duration, then use the Echoes of Great Sundering Earthquake. The Echoes of Great Sundering Earthquake will also put a Lightning Rod debuff on the target and give you the Surge of Power buff. So when you cast Earthquake, follow that up with a Lightning Bolt. You'll still want to cast Lava Burst before your Elemental Blast or Earthquake if it is available. And this will help you maintain 2 Lightning Rods very easily. And you really will only have to target your main target when you're casting your Earthquake. You don't have to swap targets for it, because Earthquake will actually put Lightning Rod debuff on a target that doesn't have it, as long as it's within the Earthquake. Outside of Surge of Power, you'll also want to be casting Chain Lightning as your filler spell. For 3 targets, it is the same rotation, essentially, except you'll want to be casting Chain Lightning exclusively instead of Lightning Bolt with Surge of Power. So maintain your Electrified Shocks debuffs as you would in 1 to 2 targets, and swap between Elemental Blast and Earthquakes. You can choose to cast Lava Burst if it is available to buff your Elemental Blast or Chain Lightning, but the increase in damage is negligible, so if you don't want to cast it, don't worry about it. For multi-target / AoE, so like I'm talking like 4 more targets here. For 4 targets specifically, it's the same rotation as 3 targets, but the only time you would ever cast Lava Burst in this scenario is to buff your Stormkeeper empowered Chain Lightnings with Master of the Elements. Outside of that, maintain your Electrified Shocks debuffs on the targets and build Maelstrom with Chain Lightning while swapping between Elemental Blast and Earthquakes as spenders, okay? Target swap as you can to spread your Lightning Rod debuffs if you're generating a lot of Maelstrom with your Stormkeeper windows. And so you don't need to really worry about your Earthquake casts as much with this. For 5 targets or more, ignore casting Ice Fury and Frost Shocks unless you have to move, and the GCDs of the empowered Frost Shocks can help you with that. Otherwise, target swap and spread your Lightning Rod debuffs when you're casting Elemental Blast. Just spam Chain Lightning to build Maelstrom, and you don't ever really need to cast Lava Burst. For 6 targets or more, it's the same as 5 targets, but the only thing I can say to add a boost to your damage is to game your Surge of Powers within Stormkeeper windows. So Surge of Power gives your Chain Lightning an additional target to hit when you consume it with Chain Lightning. This increases Maelstrom generation, obviously. So, but also Lightning Rod damage from your single cast of Chain Lightning. Okay? So my advice would be when you're preparing for a Stormkeeper burst window, pool enough Maelstrom, all right, to be able to cast an Elemental Blast and Earthquake back to back. All right, this will apply 2 Lightning Rod debuffs to your enemies and then cast the Chain Lightning. Surge of Power will be consumed, and your Maelstrom will almost cap yet again and be able to repeat this by casting Elemental Blast and Earthquake yet again. Repeat this until you've used up all your Stormkeeper charges, and then you should be swapping between Chain Lightning and your spenders, right? Because you want to be using that Surge of Power buff on Chain Lightning. You don't want to waste any Maelstrom in AoE, obviously, so that's why it would be a significant damage loss if you don't track your tier set for this situation. Otherwise, outside of Stormkeeper, like I said, weave in Chain Lightnings every time you cast an Elemental Blast or Earthquake. Cooldown usage. The best advice I can give for effectively using your cooldowns in keys is to getting used to the routes that your group or pug is going to run. So normally pugs will communicate with Mythic dungeon tools, what route they're going to be doing, what pulls they're going to be doing. Knowing ahead of time which pulls you're going to be able to use your cooldowns with is a good idea, obviously. So for Storm Elemental or Bloodlust, right? Thankfully, the Elemental Shaman has very short burst cooldowns, and our burst windows are very frequent, with Stormkeeper itself, Liquid Magma Totem, the tier set being on a 50-second internal cooldown, and Flash of Lightning reducing the cooldown of Stormkeeper and Storm Elemental even further. So be smart with the usage, though. If mobs are about to die, it's probably best that you save your Stormkeeper or Liquid Magma Totem for the next pull and pool your Maelstrom instead in preparation for it. Maybe you even have enough time to like pull enough Maelstrom to then Elemental Blast. You get an Echoes of Great Sundering proc. You pull enough Maelstrom as well to get fully capped, and then you go into the next pull with a full Maelstrom bar and an Echoes of Great Sundering buff. Really, really useful to do that. That actually leads me into my tips. So leads me into my Mythic Plus tips. The big hitter is definitely pooling your Maelstrom, as I mentioned. Starting out with probably 2 Lightning Rod debuffs, a fully empowered Earthquake down, and all of your Stormkeeper charges is probably some of the highest burst potential in the game among DPS. The numbers that you can get from this kind of combo, when you do it correctly, it's extremely impressive, to say the least. So, though it is obviously rare for it to happen, if you plan your cooldowns effectively around the route, right, it's more often that it's going to work out in your favor. Another tip would be to use your utility spells and use them often. You should be the highest on interrupts in groups by the end of the dungeon, because you have the shortest kick in the game already, and then you can make it even shorter with Flash of Lightning, right? Which is so powerful in Mythic Plus. Communicate with your group when you have, or when you can help the healer / tank with Earth Elemental, right? Just normally it can be used to take pressure off the tank or help you set up like bigger pulls for the tank to not have to use or commit too many of their cooldowns when gathering up the mobs, right? So just be careful if you have melee in the group to not screw them over with the frontal cone abilities from some enemy mobs in dungeons. Another tip would be to change your rotation and spell priority on the fly based on the number of mobs that you're fighting. I talk about this in a lot of my guide videos. For example, if you are starting the pull with like 3 or 4 mobs, but then you're going to be chaining into a bigger number of mobs to be more than like 6 targets, at the start of combat, you should include Ice Fury and Frost Shocks into that damage rotation, especially if you're moving a lot. So these instant cast Frost Shocks, like, they can help you maintain damage on the move, you know, build up enough Maelstrom in preparation for the pull, and then you can Chain Lightning as well and include a slow or a snare on those mobs to help the tank not take as much damage. If you're tracking your tier set Stormkeeper internal cooldown, you can actually reset its internal cooldown from the start of the keys. This is a pretty big one. Especially when like you have a big key or like a big pull at the start of a dungeon, right? This is extremely useful for your burst window. So this way it won't proc immediately when you start the dungeon and like mobs are grouping from the tank, right? If you time it correctly, you can have that Stormkeeper charge be used more effectively during your burst window when you have like multiple lightning rods active at once. You can actually proc this by either pulling mobs at the start of a dungeon and having it proc, or just using a training dummy toy if you're in a dungeon that's like outside and you can mount or something. Another tip for lightning rod, I think this one kind of is a little less well known. So when you're casting Elemental Blast and Earthquake back to back for a Stormkeeper burst window, you should either wait like a quarter of a second or half a second to cast the Earthquake, or to put Lightning Rod on the second target. That way you have 2 Lightning Rods out, because if you cast Elemental Blast and then Earthquake immediately after, the Elemental Blast has a travel time, right? But that also means that the Lightning Rod has a travel time. So if you cast the Earthquake right after, it will apply to your current target a Lightning Rod debuff, but then the Elemental Blast that hits that target will also refresh that Lightning Rod debuff. So you're going to be wasting essentially an extra Lightning Rod. So what you can do to kind of game this is either while you're casting Elemental Blast, tab target to a mob that does not have a Lightning Rod active and then press the Earthquake, or you can wait just a quarter of a second after casting Elemental Blast to then cast the Earthquake. I prefer to tab target. It's just quicker for me. And you can kind of get into this little dance of it, but this trick just ensures that you don't waste any Lightning Rod debuffs, and you're going to be fine if you use this trick, because the game scripting for Lightning Rod is kind of beans, apparently. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate it. If you like the content, subscribe for more. Like the video if you like it. Comment down below what your thoughts are on Elemental Shaman and the Season 2. Don't forget to check out my Twitch live stream, where I stream as much as I can with what's going on today. Check out my Instagram and Twitter, like where I post content. Subscribe to my Patreon page if you guys want to support my content. It helps me create more content like this with my editor David, like I mentioned before. And I'm also reintroducing coaching. So if you guys are interested in the coaching services, one-on-ones, where we look over Warcraft logs, video review, log review, right? Gearing, stats, everything under the sun, Weakauras, right? Add-ons, anything that you guys need help with, message me in my Discord under the coaching channel. I'll leave a link to my Discord in the description of the video down below, so you guys can check that out. But hope you guys enjoyed the video, and until next time, keep calm and Maelstrom on. Bye-bye.